What is the scariest story you know? That is 100% true. I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things. A batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters, small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful. Just down on his luck, she didn't press charges. Instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy-ish with a happy ending. My mom was driving, and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked, who knows what would have happened to her. Niche. A train disaster is something that reminds me how death can come at any moment. A train with 51 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Khayyam, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes, and it really explodes. The whole town of Khayyam is literally demolished. 3 nearby towns are badly damaged and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on Richter scale was produced. The 1904 Cincinnati Privy disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 m, 35 feet, deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. When my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and read her and pushed her off. Somehow she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut. I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burned with acid or set on fire. And it used to be so normal, like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases where her family didn't pay the husband enough money so they killed her. Many years later I revisited those memories and realized how insane that actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18 and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still, so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own she was covered in. Found out later she was drugged at the club that night early morning. Red and left blacked out in the alley. It was just a fed up and surreal situation to be involved in. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on what Ave, Sacramento. Guy goes into a small building and dies. Later, investigator shows up and sees the body, calls 911 and then dies. Paramedics show up to help them, then die. The reason? Oxygen levels at head height were normal. Oxygen levels when bent over was basically zero. Bending over in this room killed 4 people by asphyxiation. Old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went biping. Worked at the school for 20 plus years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him and in the process of moving out, he caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. My friend tripped and fell onto the tracks, landing his face onto the third rail. We kinda stood there in absolute shock because we thought he was dead. But then he said, "Can I move? Will I be electrocuted?" We told him to move instantly and he did. We got him off the tracks, and no less than 2 minutes later a train went zipping by. I think the third rail turned on seconds after his face came off of it. I know that's not scary to a lot of people, but to me it was because I would have lost a close friend back when I was about 12. That there's a guy casing the bar that I work at literally right now, and I can't do anything to stop him. He's been in asking what time days we're open, and what days we have security. Caught him feeling the corners of our windows and doors too. Unfortunately, until he breaks in and robs us, the police won't do a thing. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between 2 trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. The case of Elizabeth Smart. She was kidnapped, repeatedly read, psychologically tortured, and then brought around in plain sight in heavy religious garb. She had brushes with people who could have helped her, but her kidnapper claimed she wasn't allowed to speak in public or reveal her face for religious reasons. The reason she was rescued is because her sister was awake during her kidnapping and pretended to be asleep. She knew she recognized the voice, but it took her 9 months to remember it was a guy that used to do yard work for the family. The police didn't believe her because of the elapsed time, but pursued it to appease the family. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally read her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave. I've posted this before, but mine. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team. Out for beers and pizza after with the guys. Family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples. Both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other 2 couples had left their kids at one of their houses. With a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea, though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter, and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to Banks, a grocery store where one dad was manager, and clear out accounts as safe. They then came back to the house and slaughtered both families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, kids included. They caught the 2 guys later on. My dad attended the trials and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day, too. There was a woman who worked in a science lab who spilled 2 drops of organic mercury on the back of her gloved hand. Those 2 drops destroyed her entire nervous system and brain. I made the mistake of reading about the Anthill kids cult at night. I don't recommend it. Starts of like a typical hippie apocalypse type cult, ends with a lot of mutilation and murder. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door and pushed a bunch of boxes against it and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. The Lake Nas Disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself, and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact and the only reason the 3rd survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town 4 months after to be a warning to all. John List killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, cancelling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murder, so he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. Dude was working on a tuna steamer and they closed him in and steamed him. I can't help but imagine that as anything but a truly terrifying and painful way to die. One of the main reasons I never could bring myself to do real factory labor is because I don't trust people enough to not tuna steam me. 3 sailors survived the sinking of the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, only to die 16 days later. Due to the lack of air, the Navy knew they were there, but couldn't get to them. 16 days to die. In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work. Arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullsh. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught, his mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, NY. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light, and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow, and smashed head on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My god, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten moth affair driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Lohud and Channel 12 News. Happened to me. Have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 feet, she was 5 feet 3 inches, and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. On the 20th of September, 1987 in Bellingham, Washington, a Georgia Pacific paper mill worker was sent to inspect a heat exchanger system in the steam plant. Inside the base of the stack, he spotted a charred skeleton. To this day, no one is certain who the victim was, how they wound up in such a horrible place, nor why. Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for RE and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters. They died before she was born. One day they decided to play hide and seek or something. So anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated. A woman named Joyce Vincent died alone in her bedsit apartment in London and wasn't found for 2 years. She was only discovered because bailiffs came to evict her from the property and instead found her decomposed body in half skeleton form. The TV had been on, and the windows had been open, for 2 years. Despite the smell and the noise emanating from the apartment, no one had come sooner and found her. Because of the state her body was found in, they could only identify her through matching her teeth to a photograph of her smiling. Because there was basically no body left to study, no one knows how she passed. Her friends guess it was anything from murder to an asthma attack, but no one can ever know. It's not the most scary story in terms of its gruesomeness. Some tales in this thread have made me nauseous. But to think someone can die alone and not be found by their family or friends for so long, especially in such a densely populated city, effing terrifies me. A pub in Colnbrook, Berkshire in UK has a pretty terrifying history. The ostrich has seen its fair share of murders and they say that over 60 were committed here. Most famous of all were those committed in the 17th century by the landlord of the time, Jarman, who with his wife made a very profitable sideline by murdering their guests after they had retired for the night. They had a trapdoor built into the floor of one of their bedrooms, and when a suitably rich candidate arrived, Jarman would inform his wife that a fat pig was available if she wanted one. She would reply by asking her husband to put him in the sty for till the morrow. The bedstead was hinged and they would tip the sleeping victim into a vat of boiling liquid immediately below, thus killing him. Well, I'm a bit late, and I'm not sure if anyone posted this already, but the story of Hisashi Aochi. He suffered radiation exposure so thorough his DNA was destroyed and he probably would have died in a matter of days or even hours. But doctors kept him alive for almost 3 months. He was conscious and begging for death as his body literally fell apart. Homes and the hotel he built specifically to murder people. Like something from a horror movie, but completely true. My long-term partner decided to end his life suddenly and unexpectedly a few years ago. He was the happiest person I knew, and even with 20/20 hindsight videos pouring through old messages etc, I wouldn't be able to identify any warning signs. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as already being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. Link for those interested.